Howdy, folks. Thanks for driving with me today. It's June 9th, Friday morning, heading off to work. So let's just get right to it. This episode of Traffic Time, this is episode 3. The last episode, I was talking about the FAA's investigation of Casey Neistat and the recent court case to Taylor versus the FAA in a federal court in D.C. that overturned the ability of the FAA to register drones for recreational, and some other court cases trying to come to some conclusions about drone operators, small UAS operators being, basically, are we criminals or are we not when we fly? It's so hard to tell. And I thought from a federal perspective, a nationwide perspective, I was hoping we'd be kind of done with that and we'd move on to more state issues and local government issues, laws and regulations they're passing. I wanted to do that this time. However, unbeknownst to me as I was filming that last episode, the senator from my own state, Dianne Feinstein, the Honorable Dianne Feinstein, introduced a bill into the Senate called the Drone Federalism Act of 2017. So I want to talk about that before I get into the local stuff, because it just shows you how fast things change, even at the federal level. So let's get right into that. What I want to do is go through the bill and provide some analysis. I will upload a copy of the bill, the Drone Federalism Act of 2017, to the website www.oldponggeezer.com, including some of my analysis and some of the other things we talk about today. Let's try to get through this really quick because I'm off to work and try to hopefully finish this before I get there. We're just going to get started right off with this and kind of talk through it. So the beginning of the bill, the opening kind of paragraphs, it just basically talks about what this bill, they're introducing it into the 115th session of Congress, the first session of Congress, what it is. And it's the opening line is to preserve state, local, and tribal authorities and private property rights with respect to unmanned aircraft systems and for other purposes. So right off the bat, and for other purposes. It's so ambiguous, and it just kind of feeds into that hunger that people have to just advance the confusion, and that it just fuels all that chaos, how do we interpret and for other purposes. So right off the bat, I'm like, oh, come on. But let's keep going. So it's introduced by Ms. Feinstein for herself, Mr. Lee, another senator, Mr. Blumenthal, and Mr. Cotton. And they introduced the following bill. So I want to later on, if we have time, to kind of talk about the motivation of these senators and what is it that is causing them to feel they need to introduce this type of federal level bill. Okay, so getting right into it. Once again, they state, in case you didn't get it the first time, to preserve state, local, and tribal authorities and private property rights with respect to unmanned aircraft systems and for other purposes. And then they go on to the short title, and this is where they say this act may be cited as the Drone Federalism Act of 2017. So this is kind of where they name it for us to talk about. So thank you for that. Section 2 starts off on page 2, and it talks about the preservation of state, local, and tribal authorities with respect to unmanned aircraft systems. And then it starts off with like section A or subsection A, bow-legged A. And this is where it starts to talk about the what of this bill. What is this bill? And the scope of preemption for civil unmanned aircraft regulations. And then they go on to kind of talk about things. So real quick, let's talk about preemption. So preemption is kind of like the supremacy clause in the Constitution. And basically that's the saying that federal law kind of wins out over state law when there's a conflict between the two. And so the senators are saying that this, for civil, that's another good definition, for civil aircraft, civil unmanned aircraft, and by civil they mean, which they later define the term civil on page 8 of this bill, it's not public. So it doesn't include police or firefighters or military, that kind of stuff, it's civil. And so they're talking about their preemption, and they're prescribing regulations or standards for these unmanned aircraft systems, and then they talk about what the administrator shall do. Well, they don't define who the administrator is right up front, but if you read on later on page 7, they talk about the administrator is the FAA administrator. So basically, this is the senators telling the FAA administrator that here is what we want you to define the exactly what the preemptive effect is on drones. And then they cite a couple of U.S. title codes, 40103 and 41713, which are basically the U.S. codes that say that the federal government owns the airspace and no states can create laws that affect interstate commerce, and every member of the public has a right to the airspace. So they're saying within that context, what is the preemptive rights of drones? And they're trying to tell the FAA administrator to establish these clear guidelines. And really what they're kind of coming afterwards is that the FAA should have, back in 2012 when they started that whole FAA Modernization Act, they should have done all this stuff ahead already. So the senators are kind of saying, you guys didn't do your job, here's what we want you to do. They're trying to direct the administrator to be specific about where the federal law applies and how it cannot, and what they'll say here in a minute, how they cannot, the federal law does not take away states' rights to protect the public. So they're saying that the preemptive effect, they want the administrator to define, and they say shall be limited to the extent necessary to ensure the safety and efficiency of the national airspace system for interstate commerce. I kind of find that interesting, interstate commerce, because there's a whole lot of things in commercial law about you cannot transport. If you think about how Part 107 is even written, that drones cannot be used to transport goods and materials across state lines. So it kind of gets into that. So the federal, they're trying to say, we're going to protect the national airspace. Here's FAA, here's your boundaries. Protection of the national airspace related to interstate commerce, and you cannot encroach upon the state's rights too. And this is where they go on to say that they are instructing the FAA administrator to preserve the legitimate interests of the local government, state, local, tribal governments. And they define what they mean by that. They are saying the states have the right to protect public safety, to protect personal privacy, to protect property rights, to manage land use, and restrict nuisance and noise pollution. So Section 2 is basically Part A, this scope kind of statement, this here's what you need to do. These senators are directing the FAA administrator to define what should have been done with the FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012, and they really didn't do it to anybody's satisfaction at this point. So B goes on to talk about reserve powers. So B is kind of, section B of this is, subsection B is kind of the how. How is this bill supposed to be implemented? And in general, they're prescribing regulations or standards for unmanned systems. And they say the administrator shall, when they say shall, that means that you're going to do it. It's not may, it's not, if you feel like it, it's shall. You will do this. When the FAA administrator creates this rule, this definition, she will ensure the authority of the state, local, or tribal governments to issue reasonable restrictions. So issuing reasonable restrictions on the time, the manner, the place of operation of civil unmanned aircraft systems. Okay, and here's where it gets quantifiable. Below 200 feet above ground level or within 200 feet of a structure. And they're saying that the FAA administrator will ensure that that right of the states is not preempted. We talked about preempted. So they have the right to govern the airspace below 200 feet. So that's kind of where this bill is started. And that's reasonable if you think about it. So it's kind of what, as a drone operator, what we've wanted is how high above a house can I fly legally? And there's been no clear definition of where does airspace start. You've heard about, well, from the blade of grass all the way up to the heavens is where the FAA controls everything, which isn't exactly true. We know from other court cases that that's not how it goes. However, there's been no real clear definition. So at least these senators are trying to say, here is an exact measurement, 200 feet above ground level, that you cannot fly below, or not that you can't fly below that, but the municipal, the local governments have the right to manage or to pass ordinances or laws or whatever to restrict operations in that piece of airspace. So that's not such a bad thing. We can argue whether 200 feet is fair, but for whatever reason, at least 200 feet, at least that gives a drone pilot something to go by. That it's easy. I'm above 200 feet. I'm in the sky. I'm in the airspace between 200 and 400 feet because I can't fly above 400 feet. That's my navigable airspace. I am good to go, and nobody can pass a law to stop me from doing what I need to do as a recreational pilot and following all the other rules. And that's okay. I think that's okay. So anyway, they go on and they talk about reasonable restrictions. So at first they talk about the reserve powers, and that's like what we just talked about. Then they talk about reasonable restrictions, and this is where this bill kind of starts to fall apart, because they start introducing these concepts that are really just what is a reasonable restriction? Reasonable to who? And this is where it kind of gets messy, and where it becomes litigation and court cases that the courts clearly are having a hard time siding with, or not even siding, they're trying to make a decision on. They keep kind of avoiding it. So this is where it's like, oh, we gotta have something a little bit more solid to hang our hats on besides just these vague terms. It just some of the stuff that they talk about after this, it just plays into that kind of that hysteria and that misconception that government and the members of the public have about drones. So anyway, they talk about reasonable restrictions. Here they are. Limitations on speed. And that's okay. Okay, yeah, of course. If you have a drone that can fly 80 miles an hour, you may want to say, yeah, you can fly in this park, but you have to keep it under 30 or 25 or 50 or whatever. And that's okay. I can understand that, because that is a safety thing. The slower the object goes, the less damage it's going to do if it hits something or somebody. So I kind of understand that if we can agree on what is reasonable. Obviously 2 miles an hour is not a reasonable speed, but they place restrictions on the speed here on the American River Park Trail for bicycles. You can only, there's a speed limit for bicyclists. So it's okay, yeah, it's reasonable to me. Okay, part B, next one. Prohibitions or limitations on the operations in the vicinity of schools. Sure. You don't want a drone hovering over your elementary school taking pictures of your little kids, of course. Parks. Okay, if it's reasonable. That one's kind of tough, but okay. Roadways. Yeah, we don't want to fly over a highway. Bridges. Okay, that's kind of infrastructure. Okay, so we're talking recreational so far, I think. And then here goes haywire again. Or other public or private property. So let's read that whole thing in its entirety. Prohibitions or limitations on operations in the vicinity of schools, parks, roadways, bridges, or other public or private property. That is basically every square inch of the United States of America. Part C, it goes on. Restrictions on the operations at certain times of the day or week. There again, that's so vague. Certain times of the day of the week. Whatever. It just goes crazy. So that just seems to be kind of burdensome and hard to enforce. Okay, but it says restrictions on the operation at certain times of the day or week, or on specific occasions such as during parades or sporting events, which that's fine, because that's already kind of part of the recreational users, and the FAA says, you can't. We already know you can't fly over a sporting game, and that's pretty obvious. You're not supposed to fly over parades anyway, so I'm okay with that. D is prohibitions on the operation while the operator is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Yeah, that's a no-brainer, of course. That's already in the federal guidelines, so that's fine. And prohibitions on reckless operations. Once again, of course, yeah, why wouldn't we support that? And there's bills, and we've already talked about in Traffic Time episode 2, we already talked about this kind of stuff. Yeah, awesome. We could go with that. So there's within those first ones are some of them are reasonable and some of them are not, but you can kind of see where they're going with this. And then the final one is here's where we kind of go off the rails again. Other prohibitions that protect public safety, personal privacy, or property rights. Let me let that sink in for a second, because that's really what this bill is about. Protection of public safety, personal privacy, or property rights. And they are saying the FAA cannot create a law that does not allow the states to have the authority over that. And then they go on to say the last thing is restrictions on noise pollution. There again, that one is a little bit tougher for me, because that plays into the misconceptions, I think. And what is noise pollution? It's almost added at the end here. It's almost kind of offensive, almost like they're just piling on stuff that they can think of, and you can just see it's some grumpy person who is just like, your music's too loud. And it kind of turns into that bullying thing. It's like, because there are so many other devices that people have recreational using, motorcycles, dune buggies, ATVs, really loud stereos, really loud cars without the proper mufflers, and they have laws and stuff about that, but they are way louder than a Mavic drone is at 50 feet away. So that's just sort of like, it's sort of like a kick in the teeth, that they're just, you can't fly, that drone's too noisy. We're going to make an ordinance that you can't fly because it's too noisy. And I don't buy that one. So this is where it kind of gets a little bit crazy, but whatever. All right, let me get off the freeway here. Clearly, I'm not going to get through all this. We just finished Section 2. I'm going to go to work, and then on the way home, we'll start back again with Section 3. Okay, before I went to work, we got through Section 2 of the Drone Federalism Act. So let's go on with Section 3. Here we go. And this is kind of where they get back into the Constitution. They're talking about the taking clause, and that's based on like the Fifth Amendment, and that's basically saying that the federal government cannot pass a law that takes away the rights of the private citizen, or I guess any property rights. So they're saying basically this law should, or this act is trying to get the FAA to acknowledge that you cannot allow a drone to fly over someone's personal property for the public use that violates their rights to their property. So going back to that taking clause, and okay, I got that. That feeds into the whole privacy and trespassing and all the other stuff. And so I see where they're trying to hang on this, hang this bill on, and what direction they're trying to go. And that makes a lot of sense. If I wasn't a drone pilot, would I want some drone flying 50 feet over my house? No. I wouldn't anyway, even as a drone pilot. So I mean, that's okay. They're trying to like say, hey, let's do something. Let's find let's find our way. Let's find our air, and where is the sky for these drones? And so I can see that, and that's fine. And they go back and they talk about this prescribing regulations or standards for civil unmanned aircraft. The administrator shall not authorize the operation of a civil unmanned aircraft in the immediate reaches of the airspace above property. And they've already defined, or they later on define immediate reaches as that 200 feet or below, or up to 200 feet. So okay, so we're establishing some kind of a clear blanket over someone's property, whether it's private or public, that is not navigable to a drone. So I can see the direction of that, and that's not a bad thing. So we shouldn't be too just violently scared and reactive to this thing, because you can see where they're going if they just kind of cleaned it up a little bit, because you can't say reasonable blah 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 and expect any local government to be reasonable to all parties, because whoever's the loudest is going to win. And right now, anybody affiliated with any unmanned aircraft, we are not the loudest voice by any means. So we are going to probably lose these battles if it were to be published just like it is here. And then they go on to say a little bit more about the taking clause, and then they talk about how to amend the FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012. In this bill, they talk about how to amend it and where they would put in how they would change the wordings to address or to incorporate this bill were it to pass. You can read that for yourself and go back to the actual 2012 Act and see how it all fits together. And then they go on and they talk about definitions, and that's kind of, we've already really talked about it, but really their definitions, they're talking about the area within 200 feet. So they're establishing the first two rules. They're great. They're gold. The operation of civil unmanned aircraft includes any area within 200 feet above ground, any area within 200 feet above any structure on the property, okay, which is very similar to what we've got now with our 400 foot or 400 foot above a structure. So it gives us that 200 foot window we can fly in. Once again, maybe that 200 feet could be negotiated, but at least that's something that's solid, it's measurable, it's easy to understand, good to go. And they're saying, the way I understand this or interpret this, that the local governments will not restrict operations above 200 feet. They have no authority over that. That's the FAA's authority. So that's okay. As long as you're above 200 feet, you can kind of do what you've been doing. Okay. Here's where it kind of goes haywire, goes off the rails again. The third one, any area where operation of the aircraft system could interfere with the enjoyment or use of the property. Once again, that's anywhere, any airspace, any height, any place in the entire United States could fall under that, and we're back in court with no clear decision, no clear rules. So that's where it gets kind of haywire. I would rather not have that in there and let local governments go through the courts to decide the rest of that stuff. Okay, and then Section 4 goes on to talk about a pilot program on federal partnerships. And this, I'm not sure what the goal of Section 4 is here. It's talking about the administrator shall provide technical assistance to governments. They're going to have this pilot program. They're going to pick like up to 10 state, local, tribal governments, and it has to be like one state government, one local, one tribal, one this, one that. They're kind of showing how it has to be. But they're saying that the administrator shall provide technical assistance and work with these governments in the regulation of the unmanned aircraft, and including the use of technologies to kind of help control or to enforce laws and restrictions on drones. So they're kind of saying, here's where the FAA is going to, here's the FAA's jurisdiction, here's under 200 feet, here's the local jurisdiction, and we're going to help you to find ways to enforce, and hopefully in a standardized way across all of these different agencies, to coordinate these efforts to enforce these regulations. So, and then they go on to talk about an unmanned aircraft traffic system. They're going to use these governments, these up to 10 local entities, and they're going to try to work using them to coordinate with NASA to help identify or help build this traffic management system for unmanned aircraft. And reportedly NASA's already working on a tracking system for drones, and so they're trying to here are these agencies that we've partnered with, the FAA, here are these agencies, and we're trying to pass some standardized regulations, and here's some of the methods that we're going to use to enforce, whether it's identifying drones, controlling the air, helping control the airspace, helping everybody be safe, and kind of work that out. So that's not a bad thing. It's probably an impossible thing to do, but if they talk about a pilot program and they pick 10 forward-thinking, technologically savvy governments to kind of start this program off, and they get it going, that could actually be a good thing. And so my thought when I read through this is, why didn't they kind of start off the bill with this and saying, we want this federalization, the Drone Federalization Act, we want to try to do a better job, because clearly these senators are trying to protect their constituents. They're trying to protect private property, privacy laws, public safety. Why not start with this idea of, we're going to pick these 10 agencies to partner with, the FAA will, and try to come up with not only a way to work with NASA or other technology leaders to develop this tracking system to be able to manage the airspace and potentially track these drone operators and figure out who's doing what, legal or unlegal, just like a radar gun on a highway with a police officer and checking for speed. And then we're going to work on consistent, fair, reasonable laws, ordinances, punishments for such things, and kind of work that in where we can kind of roll that out to a larger audience, eventually the whole United States, as whether it's a suggestion or more of a mandate of, here's how you will do it, however that works. Start off with that and then work into those details we talked about at the beginning, and what we're talking about is the FAA has this space, the local level can have 200 feet and below, or maybe we could say 100 feet, whatever, and work those details kind of in the opposite direction of the way this bill was presented. It would be a little bit more clear. And then finally, they go on to talk about on page 7, kind of the last meat of this bill, they talk about reporting requirements. So the FAA's got like a year to kind of get this started, and then no later than 2 years they have to report back to Congress with these results. And so by this, now we're talking like 2020 before the pilot program kind of winds down. And really, if you look, based on the implementation of the Modernization Act from 2012, the FAA didn't really jump right on that and do everything they were supposed to do in a timely manner. And if this bill were actually to pass, there's really no guarantee that the FAA would move any faster on this type of stuff, because you got to keep in mind, this is not the FAA's management of drones, unmanned aircraft in the national airspace is kind of minor, a small sliver of everything they have to do. So, this might end up being like a 5-year thing if it were to pass. So do we have to get all wound up about it and get crazy? Not necessarily. Do we have to be alert that this is going on and talk to our congressmen and say, hey, try to change their mind? Yeah, we should. Should we be flying as safe as possible? Absolutely. Should we be trying to protect public safety as an operator, recreational or not, recreational or commercial? Should we be trying to protect public safety, to protect privacy, to protect trespass and property rights? Absolutely. If we were doing that in the first place, we as everybody, we wouldn't have this problem. But we've got a lot of people who can buy a drone and they're flying it that afternoon with no idea what these laws are. So there's a big educational component that goes along with it. So that's kind of the meat of this bill. And then they kind of finish off with talking about rules of construction, and this doesn't have anything to do with manned aircraft and blah blah blah. And then they finish off with definitions, and they talk about all these words, which you can read about those. There's nothing that we haven't talked about already. So that's kind of what's going on in this bill. Where it lacks, what this bill is not doing, it doesn't. It leaves a little bit of interpretation if I read it right. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I should have started off with this. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not providing legal advice. I'm just kind of trying to read this and interpret it as a drone pilot, as owning a drone and wanting to fly. I'm trying to read this to try to figure out what it all means if it were to pass. So it doesn't talk about really the big burning question that we all have at the beginning is, does it explicitly classify a small unmanned aircraft system is it an aircraft or is it a model aircraft? And that's been the raging debate. I think clearly this bill is geared towards saying that these things are model aircrafts. A drone is not in any way an aircraft. And I think the recent Taylor versus the FAA case points to that. I think this bill kind of also points to that. And I think that's the direction it's going. It's hard to say that this is a drone is an aircraft. Now, from recreational purposes. And that's the next point, is this bill does not really, it kind of alludes to they're just talking about recreational or hobbyists, but it doesn't distinguish any type of a difference between a recreational, it doesn't, like, to me, it doesn't say we're talking about recreational users, recreational pilots. It doesn't talk about commercial pilots that really fall under 14 CFR Part 107, subpart B if you want to draw all the way down. It doesn't mention commercial use of small UAS. And so does this bill apply to anybody flying a drone, or is this only recreational? If you are a Part 107 certified pilot, are you exempt from this? And they should say that somewhere in this bill, that they say it doesn't apply to manned aircraft. They should also say this does not apply to commercial small UAS. Or they should say that it does. Say it so we know. And if this bill is really geared only towards the recreational aircraft, it kind of, I don't know if it contradicts is the right way to say it, but it kind of contradicts the limitations that were placed on the FAA originally under the FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012, Section 336. Because they're not supposed to, the FAA is not supposed to write any laws that govern recreational aircraft. So Senator Feinstein and the senators who authored this bill, they're not telling the FAA to write or define any types of standards or regulations over recreational drones. They're kind of saying you need to write some guidelines that don't preempt the states from their ability to regulate these drones. So it's some kind of like inverse negative legislation. It's like, and it's just hard to like. They're saying on the one hand, in 2012, FAA, you have no right to do any rules over drones, over recreational users. And then the Taylor versus FAA kind of enforced that. Yeah, you do not have any rights. So they made the FAA stop doing those registrations for recreational users. But now they're saying, but you do need to write it in such a way that the states can do this. So it's just kind of a weird thing to do. So that's kind of in a nutshell, that's kind of where we're at on this thing. Will it pass? Maybe, maybe not. If it does pass, what is the outcome? It's just going to be a mess. It doesn't add a lot. There's some little things in there. Actually, there's a lot of pieces of this legislation that actually work really well, and the direction that they're trying to go, in a sense, is really potentially positive for anybody who wants to fly a drone. If they could clarify things a little bit and get rid of all of that really ambiguous language that's just not enforceable. It's going to take don't write something that you automatically know the courts are going to have to decide in the first week. So that's where, if they could clean it up a little bit, I'd be like, yes, this is awesome. I like that. I don't like 200 feet necessarily. I think that's a little bit restrictive. It's a little bit too high, but I could live with it. I would like it a little bit lower. if they looked at what the cameras look like on these things and are we really invading, but maybe, whatever, it's fine. But at least it's something to say, don't fly 200 feet over this property, but above 200 feet, you could do what you need to do. And that's fine. I say, great, at least I know. So that's kind of in a long-winded discussion. That's kind of what's going on with this bill. It's potentially, it could change things, and it could not really make any difference, and we're still going to be back in court 2 years later with all kinds of court cases, and we still don't know what we're supposed to do. But at least they're kind of like they're kind of moving in a direction, and they're telling the FAA, you need to get your act together, you need to do a better job to protect all these things. So okay, so let's look at the positive parts of this, and hopefully we can help them through our conversations with our local senators and government officials to try to help get past those really hard parts to regulate. And let's go back to the motivation, since I've got some time here, hopefully. Let's go back to what these senators, what are their motivations. I start off with Senator Feinstein, because she's the main author of this bill, and I kind of looked at some of the stuff she has done in the past. And you can go all the way back to 2012, I think, and there was an incident around really near LAX where apparently a passenger plane had a close encounter with a drone, and that's kind of what got her started, I think, looking at these drones. And then we're at the 115th session, I guess it is, of Congress. So last year, really 2015, but the 114th Assembly of Congress, she introduced a very similar bill, she being Dianne Feinstein, called the Consumer Drone Safety Act. And it's very similar to this. In a lot of ways, it might be a little bit better. I didn't read through with as much detail as I did on this one, because obviously this one, the one she did in 2015, got defeated. The Consumer Drone Safety, I shouldn't say defeated. The Consumer Drone Safety Act didn't go anywhere. But you can see where, if you look at that bill and look at this bill, you can see the similarities, and you can see a lot of the differences. At that point, it was only two senators, Dianne Feinstein and Senator Schumer, were the ones that introduced that particular bill, the Consumer Drone Safety Act. And they were trying to kind of, same concept though, privacy, personal property, public safety, kind of the same thing, but they didn't, a lot of ways that would have been a better bill to kind of start with, but it didn't go anywhere, so here's where we're at. But that Senator Feinstein's motivation is kind of, as you'll see with all these senators, they're really trying to, in their minds, protect the public from these drones that are going to come crashing down and kill people and cause airplanes to fall from the sky, and they're going to everybody's houses and interrupting their weekends. I'm being obviously very sarcastic, but that's kind of that, oh my God, they want to stop all that. That's kind of where all of them come from. Senator Lee is from Utah, and he seems to have gotten more, that's where he started kind of identifying with drones. I'm just looking at their websites and trying to piece together how they got to this point. And so I think his just skepticism of the technology of drones and how the military is using them for the drone strikes and stuff overseas, that's what got him started. And so I could see where he's coming from, a negative impression of what a commercial drone is in the United States. I think that's maybe feeding some of this for him to sign up on this bill. Then you've got Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut. Same thing. I think he's just sort of signing on from the he's just trying to protect public safety, and he doesn't seem to have a lot of history that I can find on drones. He made some statements about the registration. The FAA's registration of drones was a positive step, but we need more accountability. He kind of said stuff like that, but he's on board. He seems pretty reasonable. And then we have Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, who's the other of the four authors of this bill. And I can't really find anything with him that is kind of motivating him in a negative way. It's just he's same thing, just he's trying to protect his constituents, his Arkansas folks. And so he signed on for this bill, but there's no he doesn't seem to be a hater or anything like that. So okay, we got what we got, and we'll take a look at these guys. But I think Senator Feinstein is probably the biggest influence of things where she's been in contact more with the technology, especially from the military, of drone use. And in the state, she's probably experienced more complaints for whatever reason. You think she's also we've got Hollywood, we've got the paparazzi flying drones over so-and-so actor or actress's house, taking pictures. So she's probably got a lot more negative experience of drone users. And most YouTube videos, they're either filming in New York in not such a great way, or they're filming in Los Angeles in not such a great way. So I can see the negative impression that she may have and see kind of where this is coming from. So it's our job to kind of help overcome that. Okay, so that is all. Thank you for riding with me. I hope I don't have to talk anything. I hope I don't have to talk any more about federal legislation or restrictions on drone use. I want to get away from this. I want to talk a little bit about states and how confusing that is. Hopefully offer up a couple of tools that we all can use to help us understand if we're flying safe or not. Because I'm all about, I don't want to be a criminal. And that's kind of where this whole thing is going. Don't make me a criminal for pursuing my commercial interest or my recreational interest of flying this small unmanned aircraft system in whatever state I live in. Okay, that's all. Drive safe. OPG's out.